This is session 4. Ellie Lee will be giving her speech. It is called The Year I Stopped Asking What I Want to Be and Started Asking Who I Want to Be. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his letter from the Birmingham jail that the time is always right to do right. Now, I don't think I'm unique in my desire to do what is right. I think this is what most people want. But as I've been exploring what that looks like this year, I've realized that the right thing isn't always simple to discern. Earlier this year, in senior seminar, we read Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes 3:7, it says that there's a time to keep silent and a time to speak. This is something that really stood out for me because as I consider the basis of my capstone, child advocacy, I so often see myself as the Atticus Finch of situations, the person standing up, refusing to be silent, refusing to just take no for an answer. But I've realized that a lot of times the good thing and the right thing is to be silent, to listen, and to empathize as well. When Jesus was 12 years old, his parents lost him in the city of Jerusalem. When they returned to the city, they found him sitting in the temple, asking questions and listening to the teachers. Even the Messiah, the Son of God, sat, listened, and asked. This is the kind of humility I hope to practice and that I have been practicing this year. As I've focused on child advocacy, I've learned so much about the brokenness of the world that surrounds so much of this situation. But I've also learned about the redemption that is possible through and in spite of and because of this brokenness. I've also realized the power that I can have by just being someone's friend. Romans 12:15 calls us to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Someone who really exemplifies what this looks like in my life is Mrs. Payne. She's been such a role model to me in the way that she relates to students and the way that she empathizes. She's a perfect example of what it looks like to pour yourself out for students on a daily basis. Over my past 3 years at the school, I've had the unique opportunity to become a really good friend of Mrs. Payne, and I've been able to see just the impact that this empathy can have. An example of a time that she really mourned with me was over the past few years, several of the kids that I went to elementary school with committed suicide. And Mrs. Payne was the first person to reach out and show me compassion and to show me kindness. She sat and comforted me, and I will never forget the hours that she spent in her drama room crying with me. This is just one of the examples of the lamentation and the empathy that Mrs. Payne has shown me. But in a very different capacity, Mrs. Payne also rejoices with those who rejoice. On a daily basis, you can catch her in the hallways saying hi to students and greeting them by name. A couple of years ago, I asked her how she has the ability to do this, how she has so much energy to teach classes and still make time in her life for students. And she told me that she wants to make sure that no one feels invisible, that even if kids feel like they don't have any friends their own age, that someone can know their name, and that someone can say hello to them, and that someone can say that they're worthwhile, that they matter, and that someone will fight for them, someone will see them, someone will listen to them, and that someone will believe in them. Now, the idea that a smile can make someone's day has always kind of struck me as cliche. I've always been a cynic, and the idea that it's this simple to have an impact in someone's life has kind of made me cringe. But I've seen the effects that Mrs. Payne has around the school, and I wanted to have this as well. So this year especially, I've been trying to learn the name of as many students as I can and just greeting them in the halls. And this simple exercise has really transformed my entire year and my outlook on life, as I've seen what God can do through me when I make myself even slightly available to Him. I've been able to say hi to people that I never would have looked at before. I've been able to have conversations with a lot of junior hires that extend far beyond greetings. I've been able to sit with people at lunch that I never would have looked at before. And I've been able to have deep conversations with a lot of the junior hires that go to my church about how they're striving to do what is right, just like I am. Through mimicking the kindness, compassion, and empathy of Mrs. Payne, I've been able to see what it looks like as a Christian to live a life where you're able to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. Outside of this infamous Front Range bubble, there's a bigger world out there where it's not usually so easy to make connections. Earlier this year, in February, my friend Alexandra Schindewolf and I went downtown to witness a court case. Both of us are interested in pursuing law, and we thought it'd be interesting to go sit in on a case and just kind of see the ropes. So we did our research, we found a court case, a murder case, at the Court of Appeals that seemed really interesting. So we filled out our class exemption request, we poured coffee into our travel mugs and caught the 708 train down to 17th in California. Now, we thought we knew what we were doing, but we obviously did not, which is clear after quite a few wrong turns and quite a few questions asked. So we went through our first security line of the day in the Court of Appeals and looked at the case listings and realized our murder case wasn't on the list. So we realized that we also hadn't left ourselves enough time to get to the next place we needed to be, but we tried anyway. So we power walked across a couple of blocks to the next federal building. And again, we found the case listings and realized that we still weren't in the right place. So we found an information desk eventually in the basement of this second building, and there was a really helpful man who asked what we wanted. We told him that we wanted to observe a case, and he smiled at us and told us that we were lucky, that there were 3 murder cases that day, and we should be able to find something really interesting to talk about. Now, Alexandra and I smiled because we were happy that he understood what we wanted. What we really wanted was to observe justice, and it seemed to us that the best way to see this was through the most extreme case of injustice. What we did after this was we wrote down the man's instructions and walked to the 3rd building of the day, went through our 3rd security line, found our 3rd case listings, and we're still lost. So we met with a really interesting man, this kind man with a sardonic smile who offered to, quote, show us the ropes of the courtroom. He was helpful, but extremely arrogant, and he told us where we'd find his email and sent him a long thank you note for all the kindness he showed us. We never sent that email, unfortunately. But he did have a really interesting view of the court system, and he ran it like a show. He took us up to the 5th floor, where the most extreme cases were held. So Alexandra and I followed him with a little bit of apprehension, to be honest, to the top floor, and we stood outside these oak doors to a courtroom. Now, both of us were ready to observe a case. We were ready to observe a serious case. We were on the floor for felonies, but I don't think we were ready for the transformation that was about to occur in both of our lives. I know for me personally, this was one of the most transformational experiences of my senior year and of my capstone, and honestly of my life. When we went through those 2 oak doors, we entered a really, really quiet courtroom. What we saw first off was a woman standing in a witness box. We sat down and tried to listen to figure out what this court case was about, because we honestly had no idea before we walked in. But it only took us a couple of minutes to realize that this woman in the witness box was 13 years old, that she'd been attacked brutally, and that she was afraid. We'd walked 7 miles that day, been to 3 court buildings, been helped out by 2 friendly strangers, and there was 1 kid in a witness box. This was the big show that I'd wanted. I didn't realize how much I was expecting to be entertained by this day until I sat there, realizing how wrong I was. There was no production in the tears on this girl's face. And there was no fanfare in the quiet, broken way that she answered questions posed to her by people in expensive suits. I'd wanted a show of justice, but I was met instead with a show of brokenness. As soon as I stopped looking with empathy at the situation in the courtroom, I was no longer able to look for justice, because the nature of the justice I want to pursue is so closely tied to empathy that it cannot exist without it. I had chosen, in the course of one morning, the basis of my capstone, please remember, is advocacy, is empathy, and is of helping children. But in the course of one morning, this was all replaced with the desire to see a show. I took the apathetic opt-out almost immediately when faced with a courtroom. And this has shown me just how hard I'll have to strive to not let this happen if I choose to pursue law. That I'll have to choose empathy very intentionally. And that I'll have to choose to look for what is good. I forgot in the course of this one morning that by the time justice is needed, someone has already been hurt. How do you come back to Front Range after an experience like this? Inside these safe walls, my experiences are mostly with AP classes and homework. But what really encouraged me was Ephesians 4:1, which that says, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. I had to realize coming back that the calling I've received doesn't just include the courtroom, doesn't just include empathy, but it also includes the very dirty, simple, and mundane tasks that being a student can require. An example of this is just staying after chapel to pick up trash. Honestly, it takes 5 minutes out of my day, but it really I've had to be humbled almost every single week to stay behind because it's not something I want to do. But it's the good thing, and I've realized that even if it's something as simple as bending over to pick up a piece of trash, it's worthy of doing. The life that I need to live, the one worthy of the calling I've received, includes the dirty and it includes the mundane. I think about the verse in John 3:30 a lot that says, he must increase, but I must decrease. Doing what is right often includes the dirty and mundane. And when my decreasing isn't something heroic, but merely something simple, I have to remember that that's still worth doing. Someone who lives a life that amazes me and who's extremely selfless in everything that she does is Mrs. McCollum. She works down at the preschool. This is Dan McCollum's mom. And because I'm interested in maybe pursuing teaching, I wanted to go down and interview her and ask what her opinion was on early childhood education. I got so much more than I bargained for because Mrs. McCollum is much more amazing than I'd originally assumed. When she went to college, she actually majored in play therapy, which exists to help kids under the age of 11 get understand traumatic events that have happened to them through the capacity of play. So her work took her to Romania right after the communist government fell. Under communist rule, birth control was illegal and a lot of parents had been killed. So there were tons of children and very few people to look after them. Mrs. McCollum entered into this situation selflessly. She refused to be on the outside just pitying these poor kids, but inserted herself in and helped get these kids' cognitive development on track to give them a better shot of having a normal adulthood after they graduated from the hospital system. She told me one story that really has stuck with me all these months. She told me the story of a little boy who died of failure to thrive. What failure to thrive basically is, it's when really young kids don't have proper emotional and physical stimulation. They just stop living, even if they're healthy, even if they have food, and even if they're not sick. What Mrs. McCollum said about this is, it was enough to rock my world. It was almost as if someone had just closed a book and went on. It was super sad. For me, I walked away knowing that he was in God's arms at that point, and that there was no more failure to thrive for him, that he was thriving. What amazes me about this view is that you can see something as tragic as a child dying of nothing except for failure to thrive on this broken earth, and still have that perspective that it's okay because in God's arms he's thriving right now. This has radically changed the way that I viewed going into child advocacy, because as I work with really broken kids, it's so easy for me to get really bitter. You can ask anyone who was in my lit class last year as I read The Kite Runner. I struggled so much to get my head wrapped around these ideas of kids suffering so much. But Mrs. McCollum's viewpoint, the way that she saw this, that there was no more failure to thrive with them, really influenced the way I see the redemptive qualities, even in a really broken situation. Another, I guess, glimpse of the broken world that I've gotten is through reading this year. A book that I read at the beginning of this year is called Hope's Boy by Andrew Bridge, and it details the life of a child growing up in America's foster system. So he lived in a permanent foster home for 10 years, and he still grew up as more of a tenant than a child. But throughout his entire narrative, throughout all the tragic events that happened to him, he speaks to the uncomfortable sight of love existing alongside failure. He speaks of his mother, who is extremely mentally ill, as someone who loved him more than she could care for him. I forget that there is love amid loss, that there are kids that are broken, but are still loved incredibly too, that this brokenness does not disqualify love. Yes, love never fails, but we do, again and again and again, and children are often the ones to suffer from this failure. It's so easy for me to hate what is evil, but what I struggle to do is also to cling to what is good. It is simple for me to hate people who take advantage of children. I think it's simple for a lot of us. It's simple for me to hate people who don't see children as human. But what I have to work on is clinging to what is good. Yes, brokenness exists, but so does love, and it is just as powerful, if not more. If I live a life of advocacy, and my advocacy is driven by my hatred of people who take advantage of children, that sounds a lot like a career, that sounds like a clanging cymbal, and that's not what I want. I have to love because Christ first loved me, and he didn't just first love me, but he loved every other child on this world. And I think this is the love that needs to drive my career. As I've researched the brokenness of the foster system, I've realized just how important it is for me to remember that this love is what drives me, not the hatred of the evil in the world. As I've tried to cling to what is good in my last year of high school, I've seen my own love existing alongside my own brokenness. I have a great love for many of my peers, but it exists right alongside my own impatience and pride. Here at Front Range, I have the really unique opportunity to have a lot of friends that exist outside the homogenous high school crowd. Two examples of this are, first off, the special ed program, which is the TLC downstairs, and the junior high also being in the same building that I have my normal classes. Being friends with someone with a disability will teach you a lot about love. Being friends with someone who is in a very developmentally different place than you will teach you a lot about friendship. Through my friendship with one particular student, I've seen so much more about God and about myself and about what it means to love my friends. This particular student showed me what it's like to live a devoted life, to live a life of love and of mercy. As I've gone through difficult times in my life, she has always encouraged me. She's always told me to rely on God. And she has always reminded me that I am a child of God. These are things that I have not gotten from very many of my friends. She lives out exactly what we are called to in Hebrews 10:24, when it's written, "Let us consider how to stir one another to love and good works." This is a perfect example of those love and good works. And I've been so humbled to become not closer just to the student, but closer to God as well. Another group of people that I've been really blessed to get to know better are the junior hires in the school. A lot of times when you hear the struggles of a normal junior high student, it's really easy to dismiss them and see them as less than my own struggles. I qualify my own suffering based on the suffering of my friends, which is horrible. But as I've been able to become closer friends with a lot of kids in the junior high, I realized that pain isn't on a gradient. That one of my friends crying over a crush is the same hurt soul that I feel for things that I can consider more valid. I compare my sorrows often, but as I've become closer friends with many junior hires, I've realized that this is not the life that I'm called to lead. That sorrows are sorrows, that I'm called to weep with those who weep instead of qualifying why they're weeping. I've learned to love in spite of my own failure, and I've failed a lot, but I've also learned that love conquers this kind of failure, and if I'm willing to live a life devoted to God, He'll continually have mercy and grace on me as I stumble along. As I've examined the world a lot more this year and considered what I want to do, I've been met with an extreme show of brokenness. But I've also been able to see how this lives in balance with Christ. How when I enter into really broken and hurting situations, it's not me alone who enters into those. That there is a God who comes alongside me and who will work with me and fight for me and for these kids. Throughout this year, I've been trying to remember not just what I fight against, but who I fight for. I've realized that I have a long way to go, and that there are several times that I will fail, and fail magnificently. But I have also seen God's mercy, God's grace, and His compassion on me as I stumble along. After I graduate high school in a couple of weeks, and after I graduate college in 4 years, I hope to become a teacher who can teach with empathy and patience. If I choose to pursue law, I hope to be a lawyer who can practice law with diligence and selflessness. Right now, I have a little in front of me. I have schooling. I have the last few weeks of high school. I hope to be faithful with this little so that when I'm entrusted with much later, I will be faithful there too. Over this past year, I've learned to value virtue in my daily life. I've learned to strive to be like Jesus. I've learned that I will fail, but I've decided to never stop striving anyway. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes left, so if anyone has any questions for Ellie.
One question. Thank you for saying that about me. Just no one ever rejects me.
Thank you for being my friend, Emma.
Thank you. You like it.